Hi everybody, how are we all doing? So as part of this week's vintage and retro challenge, what I thought I'd do is just do a quick tutorial on a sort of old school film look type grade for Photoshop that I like to use. So one of the things about doing a sort of film look type effect in Photoshop or in Premiere if you're using moving image is that I think one of the things that we tend to do is we tend to go with the sort of the cliches almost, if you like, of what a film look can be, sort of grain and noise and speckle and that sort of thing. But of course, one of the things about film is that if you look at, so I've just sort of done a quick Google search for stuff shot on Hasselblad medium format cameras. So the Hasselblads, for example, really high-end, sophisticated cameras back in the film days. These are the cameras that they took to the moon, for example. So they're really high quality. So lots of film cameras would have had more grain and stuff like that, but the point I'm trying to make is that we often think of film and we immediately think of grain and artifacts and noise, and that isn't necessarily always the case. I think film has something else about it that gives it a certain look, and one of the things about sort of grain and noise and things like that, I have no real problem with it in one way, but I think, as a famous cinematographer once said, you wouldn't paint in oil paints and try and make it look like a watercolor. Do you know what I mean? So what I want to try and do with today's tutorial is to try and use a digital image, what it's good at being a digital image, but at the same time trying to give it something about the film look without adding all the artifacts and stuff, to give it that sort of slightly film sophistication kind of effect. So as we can see with this image, for example, shot on a Hasselblad, I mean, this has got a bit of noise because it's an old, as it says, it's an expired film. But this was shot on a Hasselblad, and you can kind of, there's something about it, isn't there, where you kind of know it was shot on film, and yet it wouldn't look out of place having been shot on digital, for example. It's very hard to sort of see because there isn't the sort of the usual grain and everything that we might associate with film. And even more so this one, a film shoot that I found, sort of fashion shoot that I found, shot on a Hasselblad back in 2015. And these images, they look very contemporary, they look quite digital in a way, and yet there is sort of something about them, isn't there, that makes them film look images. There's something about them that gives them that filmic quality without grain and noise and everything else. Do you know what I mean? And for me, what I think that is, what happens with film images, particularly high quality film images that don't have the grain, because grain comes from back in the day with films, the grain was something that you got with faster films that exposed to light more quickly, so the shutter didn't have to be open for so long, and that then meant that the faster films were better in sort of lower light conditions and things like that. But the trade-off was that you got quite a contrasty sort of image, and it was quite grainy. By contrast, slower films have always had this sort of sharpness that we associate with digital, and the sort of this tonality of colour, and sort of the sort of grayscale tonality. So what we're going to try and do today is replicate this kind of look, because I think what film does have is instead of the grain and things that we normally associate with it, what it universally always has is a certain sophisticated depth and nuance to it. It almost has a sort of blush. It seems to almost glow from within a little bit in a way that I think digital doesn't. These wonderful contrasts between these sort of the blue and the white colour here. When I take my mouse off it so you can actually see it, there's just something about that tonality that really just says film to me. It's almost as though it's sort of glowing a little bit from inside, and that's what we're going to try and do today. By using lots of layers, we're going to try and replicate that sort of that depth, if you see what I mean. So what we're going to do is hop over to Photoshop, and I've got a photo here just of myself from back in the day. This is quite a few years ago now, I think. As obviously I had quite a big beard back in the day. And what we're going to try and do is use this image, this just sort of basic bland source image, and give it a slightly more filmic look. Now we've already got off to a good start, haven't we, with the sort of the depth of field and everything. It's got that slight tonality to it. But let's see what we can do. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on my background, and I'm going to duplicate my layer, and I'm going to do this quite a few times. So what we're going to do is I'm going to spend a little time just naming everything so you don't get lost. So first of all, I'm going to duplicate my layer. I can turn off my background now. I'm just going to keep that in reserve in case I need to duplicate any more layers later on. Okay. So here's my background copy first. Okay. And I'm just going to rename this, he says. It's not playing ball. Okay, I shall have to go to layer and do it the long way. Rename layer, there we go. I'm going to call this black and white softest. Black and white softest. And then I'm going to duplicate this layer again. And I'm going to call this one, where's my rename? There we go. Black and white soft. And then I'm going to duplicate my layer again. There we go. And I'll come back to this one like this. I'll turn this one off for now. Okay. So I'm going to turn this one off too and just go to my black and white layer first of all. Now you can go with a more sophisticated black and white layer sort of effect if you want to. I'm literally just going to go to image and adjustments and black and white, largely because I don't want to sort of keep you waiting while I'm going through all this stuff in terms of like my tutorial, but you can spend a bit more time getting the black and white layer exactly as you want it. So the first thing I'm going to do then with the softest layer is I'm going to go up to filter, and I'm going to go to blur, and I'm going to go to Gaussian blur. Now to me, because Gaussian blur is a sort of mathematical blur, it gives quite a nice sort of old school blurry grain effect anyway. So I'm going to take that up to about sort of maybe 20 pixels, something like that, perhaps a little bit less, maybe like 16, something like that. Okay. And here's what we're going to try and do. We're going to try and layer this image up through multiple layers of sharpness and softness to try and create that sort of glow effect. Because one of the things about film is it has this weird kind of texture to it, doesn't it, where it's both sharp and a little bit soft at the same time, and that's what we're going to try and replicate here. So here's our softest layer. Then I'm going to turn on my black and white soft layer, which is a color layer. Now I suppose I could have just duplicated the black and white layer if I saved myself time, but anyway I'm going to go and do it the slightly long way around. So adjustments and black and white again you can take your time on this one. And I'm going to go to filter again and blur and Gaussian blur, but this time I'm only going to do a sort of maybe 4 pixels just to give it a slight softness to it. Okay. But what I'm also going to do with this one is I'm going to try and blend this one into the softer layer so that you can actually see the other one behind it. Now I've got various options with this. I could either just drop the opacity down like so, and so what that's doing now is I can see the softer layer underneath, see, and then this is like adding sharpness to that soft layer. Alternatively, I could go into my blend modes, and we're going to be using these blend modes later on, and sort of scroll through until I find an effect that I think works. Now the problem with using the blend modes at this stage, and as I say we will be using them later on, but the problem with using the blend modes at this stage is that they do tend to interfere with the image a little bit. So as you can see, you know, with soft light for example, you know, that's sort of making the blacks a lot darker. If I go onto screen, that's brightening up a lot of those greys that I might not want. So for now what I'm going to do is I'm probably going to leave the blend modes, and I'm just going to adjust my opacity down to sort of about 60%, something like that. Okay, so here's my sort of softer black and white base layer that I'm going to base my image on. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come to this new layer, and depending on your image you might want to add a sharpness filter at this point. I'm not going to, but you might want to. It just depends on the image that you're working with. So if it was more of a landscape, you might want to add more of a sharpness filter on, and it just depends really. You'd have to just try it out with your own image and what you're working with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to adjustments and black and white again, like so. So again, as I've said before, you can take your time on this one. What I'm going to do is I'm going to rename this one. Oh, wrong one. Rename it, and weirdly I'm going to call this black and white red. Weird, I know. Bear with me. I'm going to duplicate that layer, and I'm going to duplicate it again. Okay, and actually I'm going to duplicate it again just for good measure because I know I'm going to need it later on. So I've got my black and white red. I'm going to rename this one. For some reason I don't know why it's not playing ball with me. Oh, there we go, that's better. All right, I'm going to call this black and white green. What's he doing? What does that mean? Oh, green's going to go in the middle. and then I'm going to call this one black and white. No, not plain ball. Rename layer, and I'm going to call this black and white blue. Exciting times. And then this one I'm just going to turn off for now. Okay, so I've got black and white red, black and white green, black and white blue. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to new and layer. So like I was doing before in a previous tutorial where I was talking about monochrome imagery, what I'm going to do is underneath the blue one, I'm going to go to there. I already got my blue set up here, so using my paint bucket tool, I'm just going to fill that with blue. And what I'm going to do now is going onto my black and white blue layer, I'm now going to go to my blend modes and I'm going to change this to lighten. So previously in the other tutorial where I was talking about monochrome, I think we did hard light, didn't we? Because that created quite a nice sort of effect. But with this one, what we want to do is if we add too many layers, it's going to start darkening the whole thing off. So I want to try and lighten these layers as much as I can. I'm going to go to lighten. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold down my command key on my Mac. And if it's a PC, I can't remember exactly what it is. It might be the function key perhaps, or it could be shift. I'm not sure. Try different keys until you can select both. And then I'm just going to right click and I'm going to go to merge layers. And so now what you can see is I've got a black and white layer and blue. Ta-da! That's where that weird naming thing came from. Okay, so I'm going to do the same thing again. I've got a layer, new layer up here. Drag that down underneath my green. Okay, now I'm going to go to green and I'm going to select that. I'm using my paint bucket tool. I've now filled this with green, and then going on to this layer, I'm now going to go on to lighten, like so. Now you can't see this at the moment because I've got my blue layer turned on, so if I turn that off, you'll see what this looks like. So that all looks a bit weird, doesn't it? You know, it's sort of nice and light, but anyway, that's fine. We'll come back to that later on. Command key, select both. Right click, merge layers, and now we've got black and white and green. And then guess what? We're going to do the same thing again for red. Now, I mean, I'm just going with the classic RGBs here. So, you know, red, green and blue, obviously primary colors of light, to mix together. You could select any colors you want for this sort of, for this process. It's entirely up to you, you know, depending on what sort of effect you want to create. But I'm just going to start with these for now, and you can see what happens. So again, we've got gone to our black and white layer and selected lighten, command key, select both, and then merge these layers together. Now what we've got is a red layer, and then if we turn on this green layer and then a white layer, and if we now go to our red layer and then we go to lighten again, like so, and then we turn on our green layer and we go to lighten again, like so. Can you see what's happening now is that these layers are blending together. So have a quick think. When I add the blue layer and I put this one onto lighten, what's it going to do? Well, what it's going to do is it's going to go to white. Ta-da! How crazy is that? Because by mixing these three together in equal amounts, we're now creating white. Bonkers, I know. Right? So what we now need to do is we need to make each of these layers make up effectively a third of this image. And what we're going to do in order to do that is go onto our red layer and just go to our opacity and drag that down to about 33%, something like that. And then our green layer, take that down to about 33%, like so. And our blue layer, 33%. And now we've got ourselves an interesting kind of black and white tonality which has been produced by these monochromatic images. Some of you might be sat there at the moment thinking, hold on a minute, James, you could have just done that with curves. You could have just created these kind of effects with curves. And I completely agree, you could have done. What I like about these though is it does just create, to my eye anyway, it creates an ever so slightly different look. What it does also allow us to do, and again we could do this with curves or we could do this with other, you know, we could just adjust the values of the black and white when we first made the black and white image. But what we can do with this, with the sort of these monochromatic layers, is by adding more and more layers, to my eye anyway, it adds more depth of tonality, if you like. And that's what I'm looking for with these images. Plus, of course, by adjusting the values of this, like so, then we can create slightly different black and white tones, like that sort of thing, maybe. You know what I mean? So so that's a sort of black and white tone that we could have chosen, or maybe go that way, something like that, perhaps. Who knows? Okay, yeah, that'll do for now. Okay, so what we're going to do now then is, here's our sort of black and white layer with our soft sort of backdrop. So if we take that off, we can see the sort of that softness. And again, we could just use that black and white layer if we wanted to. It's just I've added these as sort of tonal controls, if you like. And then what we're going to do is I'm going to turn on my background now, duplicate my background like that, move that up above like so, and I'm going to then just rename this color blend, because we're not quite done yet. So this is our color layer, okay? And at the moment, obviously, we can't see any of our stacked layers underneath, so we need to use a blend mode. Now we could just blend this color layer with our black and white. I mean, we could just sort of do that, and that creates quite interesting kind of tonal effects as well, as you can see. There's quite a lot going on there, and that might be the kind of effect you might want. I mean, that does look quite retro and quite vintage, doesn't it? What I'm going to do though is just add an extra layer onto this. So I'm going to go down to the color blend mode, and I'm going to blend this color layer in with all of these others. So what we're effectively doing is creating a sort of an underlay, a black and white underlay with lots of tonality to it. Then I'm washing this color over the top, and as you can see, it's kind of quite soft. It's almost like a color wash. And then what I'm finally going to do is this layer here, which I'm going to now rename as black and white top. And it's now this layer which finishes the image, because when I turn this on, so it's now black and white, what I can now do is, as I select different blend modes, can you see how I'm now getting quite different kind of vintage type tonality to my different blend modes that I can now use to create these sort of vintage style filmic kind of looks. You see what I mean? And so these kind of different blend modes give you lots of different optionality in terms of your tones. So I could select hard light, for example, to create that sort of slightly bleach bypass look, and then I could just adjust my opacity if I wanted to sort of bring back in some of these tones in my my cheeks or whatever. And what I've got now, as I say, to my eye, is I've got lots of really interesting tonality across the sort of the skin range on my fingers, and things like that, which again I think is quite interesting. So you could adjust it to that, to overlay, or to screen, or to multiply, that sort of thing, to create that sort of slightly more grayscale kind of look, or color burn, whatever, linear burn, which creates another interesting type of effect. It's sort of darkening it off, that sort of thing. So you've got various options in terms of blend modes that you could potentially use. No, not any of these unless you want a particularly strange kind of effect, but you know what I mean. So yeah, so to me that's a way of creating a sort of film look, if you like, in Photoshop, but without necessarily adding the kind of the usual grain and noise and speckles that we tend to associate with a film look, and yet it gives it that ever so slightly sort of bloomy, layered, sophisticated, old school film finish, if you like, at least to my eye. Yeah, and you can do it with various other things as well. So here's one I was doing earlier, which is Grand Central Station in New York. It's a slightly more, you've got to watch your parameters a little bit with something like this. So with a portrait, you can really sort of go to town on the sharpness and bits and pieces. But if you do that too much in an image like this, where there's lots of detail, you end up with that slightly HDR kind of look that was on vogue a few years ago, which isn't really what we want. You know what I mean? So yeah, I mean, it just depends on what kind of thing you're after, really. But again, you can sort of start to do the same sort of thing, and bear in mind, of course, that that's not black and white either, so I could adjust that to black and white. I don't think I actually finished this one, so I can use this as my overlay layer for various different things. Yeah. So anyway, there we are. That's our tutorial. So enjoy. I hope you have some success with it. Let me know how you get on. Cheers, everybody.